If ever there was an African queen, ruler who defeated empires, that would be her. When the Portuguese first arrived in Angola, their goal was simple: find gold and enslave the locals. What they didn't expect was to be taught a lesson in respect by one woman. This is the true story of Queen Nzinga, who not only survived the empire, she thrived within it. Queen Nzinga was born around 1583 into the royal family of the Mbundu people. But this wasn't some far-off village. The Mbundu were based here in the heart of what is now Angola, where their influence stretched for miles. Even as a princess, she knew politics, war, and diplomacy. And since her father, the king, was frequently on campaign, she would even fill in for him. In fact, when the Portuguese came calling, Nzinga was the one to greet them on his behalf. Now, you may already know about this meeting because it's one of the most iconic stories of her life. After settling into the throne, the Portuguese envoys offered Nzinga a seat. It was small, low to the ground, and clearly not fit for a queen. So Nzinga did something that shocked the heck out of them. She sat on the back of one of her servants. Like, wait, what? You want to sit on the servant? That's not how it works, right? Well, yes, it actually is. In the Mbundu court, it was acceptable to ride on the backs of servants into battle and even during peace talks. Seeing this, the Portuguese realized that Nzinga wasn't going to play by their rules. They had expected to intimidate her, but she had them dead to rights. In fact, Nzinga made sure everyone understood that she was their equal. She had the audacity to declare, "We are all created by the same God. We are all human beings, and there is no kind of nobility among us that can place one above the other," which was pretty radical for the time period. And before the Portuguese could recover from the shock of it all, she was signing a treaty that would stop slave raiding in the region. Now, you might think that's a noble move for a good little queen, but really it was pure strategy. Slave raiding was an important source of income for many kingdoms in the region, and stopping it would hurt them economically. Plus, it bought her time. Time to learn everything she could about the Portuguese. Time to get allies. And boy, did she get allies. One group was the runaway slaves who hated the Portuguese just as much as she did. And if she protected them from being captured, they would fight for her cause. It was a match made in heaven. Soon, though, Nzinga was reaching out to neighboring kingdoms to form powerful alliances and learning everything she could about the Portuguese. Another ally was none other than the Dutch. You heard that right. She was working with a European colonial power against another European colonial power. See, the Dutch had been fighting the Portuguese for control of trade routes for decades. And when Nzinga asked them for support, they jumped at the chance to weaken her enemy. But she always kept her options open, even converting to Christianity. Now, don't go thinking she was losing her culture. She converted so she could work within the Portuguese system. After all, they had tried to force her to convert before, but she had refused. And later, she'd revert back to her old religion. Anyway, she wasn't the only one who did this back and forth. Many Africans converted to Christianity before reverting back to their traditional religions, too. It wasn't uncommon, and it shows just how strong her faith must have been. So Nzinga signed a treaty with the Portuguese to stop slave raiding. She allied with the Dutch against them. She converted to Christianity. Then she got her revenge. First, Nzinga needed to prepare her army. Unlike many African kingdoms, the Mbundu didn't have standing armies, only groups of men who could be called up for a few months out of the year. Now, while these armies were fierce fighters, they weren't necessarily great at following orders. So Nzinga needed to bring them together under one banner. And to do that, she did something bold. She led her troops into battle. Most princesses stayed far from the front lines, letting male relatives do the fighting. But Nzinga wanted to prove herself, especially to those soldiers who thought she was too dainty to lead them. And lead them she did. Sometimes she wore men's clothing so she could pass as a general. Other times she dressed as a warrior, complete with armor. In fact, she fought alongside her soldiers, proving herself worthy of their loyalty again and again. As for the Portuguese, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some wrote of a half-naked African queen riding into battle on an elephant. Others told tales of a sorceress who could turn herself into a lion. But no matter how they described it, they couldn't deny that she was a force to be reckoned with. For over 30 years, Nzinga led her people in guerrilla tactics against the Portuguese. They would attack supply lines, intercept patrols, and raid settlements. Then they'd run away before the Portuguese could respond. And every victory brought more people to her cause. But in 1624, Nzinga's world changed forever. The Mbundu had been fighting the Portuguese since 1575, so by this point, most of their men were experienced soldiers. And with all her allies, Nzinga was able to deal them a decisive defeat. Not only did her forces win the Battle of Cassange, they also captured 2 Portuguese forts. Now, you might think that would be enough, that the Portuguese would recognize their loss and leave, but they didn't. So Nzinga kept fighting until finally, in 1648, the Portuguese surrendered. And now we come to Nzinga the Great. Over the next 15 years, Nzinga built a thriving kingdom in Matamba. It became a refuge for those escaping Portuguese rule and a center of trade, even dealing directly with Europeans on her own terms. She also continued to empower women. Sure, many African kingdoms had female rulers, but usually they were figureheads with real power residing in male family members. Nzinga, however, appointed women to positions of power, including generals. Plus, while she was never a fan of European culture, she understood the importance of education and learning multiple languages. She sent messengers across Africa and Europe to gather information and ideas. And those messengers weren't restricted to men. Nzinga sent women too. In fact, one of them made it all the way to London. Today, we don't know her name because she was simply referred to as the Black African. But Nzinga wouldn't have sent her without a purpose. Maybe she was gathering intelligence, maybe making alliances. The point is, Nzinga wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of what African women were supposed to do. Of course, that didn't mean she played by European rules. When most kingdoms in Africa fell to colonization, Nzinga held on to her independence, thanks in part to her savvy diplomacy and willingness to use any means necessary to survive. In the end, the Portuguese feared her. Like we said, they wrote stories of her, but they didn't share them with the public. Instead, they locked them away in archives, realizing that if people knew how awesome Nzinga was, they might follow her example. As for the rest of Europe, they either ignored her or exoticized her, turning her into some mythical Amazonian warrior queen. Basically, they did the same thing they did to Sundiata, except even worse. Today, modern Angola honors Nzinga as a national hero, and her story lives on through the ages. But outside Africa, few know her name. That is until now. I'm your host, and this has been History Rewritten. As you can see, Nzinga didn't just fight, she won. Her life was a blueprint for survival under empire. She was never just a queen, she was a revolution. Now we tell stories about icons like Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, and Joan of Arc. But Nzinga deserves to be in that pantheon. She was a military leader, a cultural icon, a diplomat, and a woman ahead of her time. She's a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against you, one person can make a difference. One person can take on an empire. They tried to erase her from history, but Nzinga never lost. And neither will you. Subscribe to History Rewritten and meet the leaders they tried to hide.